So Grant, lovely to speak to you again, and thank you for agreeing to just give us some insight around our professional development series on mapping the block. This is something that a few of our coaches have asked questions around, and even myself as a trainer from time to time reflect on whether or not I could do it even better to get into that process of communication in the best possible way. So I'd love to start by asking you your thoughts on mapping the block and why we start there and what we're looking for in mapping the block to kind of know that we've got enough to move into the communication phase.
Yeah, great question, Suzanne, and thanks for making the time to and passion to do this series. I really appreciate what you're doing for the mBIT community. The mapping the block is that process of, as we know, the client comes in with an articulated outcome from their problem state or their current state, and we ask them what their outcome is to open up the conversation, to get a sense. We ask them where they're at right now, but obviously where we want to get to is an emergent outcome. Before we get to the emergent outcome, it's really powerful and useful to understand, both for you as a coach and them as a client, for generativity in their own conscious and unconscious learning processes, for them to learn about how they were, what we like to colloquially call stucking themselves, how they were blocking themselves from being able to achieve their outcomes. Because obviously if they have an articulated outcome and they're in a current state that's not that outcome, then why can't they just get there? Why can't they just go from where they are now to what they want? If they know what they want, how are they stopping themselves with incredible unconscious competency? So it's a behavioural modelling question. How are they doing themselves that informs your intuitions about how you'll guide them ultimately through the communication congruence and up into the highest expression phases. Now, at the end of the day, you don't really need to do this step. You could just go take somebody and completely ignore their articulated outcome and how they're stucking themselves, and just launch straight into asking getting them in autonomic coherence and asking their three brains for the information about how they are doing themselves in this situation and what they truly, deeply want and need, etc. And then taking the highest expression and find out what emerges. But there's a very powerful additional piece in the process of informing their intuitions as in informing your intuitions, so that in the dyad, in the emergence of the dance of the six multiple brains that are working together to coach to wisdoming and emergence, that you are really adding to how the more you understand about this person, this wonderful set of intelligences and how they're doing themselves, so you can guide them more effectively as a coach, and the generativity of them understanding their own unconscious process. Because for most people it really is a blinding flash of the obvious that they are stucking themselves. It's them who's managing to not achieve their outcomes. So when you get this difference of understanding how you're stucking yourself, is how you've been doing yourself, and then you get taken to a place of emergence where you get an emergent outcome that's often different from your initially articulated outcome. There's multiple layers of learning now occurring in your mind-body system at a head-heart-gut level, and that's really, really powerful. And that's that additional sort of wisdoming process that mBIT allows for with dwell time, etc., so that people come away from an mBIT coaching process and things change ongoingly, not just what happened in the room, shall we say. So that's where the mapping the block is so powerful, because it is bringing to conscious awareness unconscious processes for your client, so that when you step into that next stage of going that deeper levels of communication, congruence, and expression, that they've got some sort of deep material that they've become more mindful of. It's been brought out of unconscious awareness to conscious awareness, and then this dance between unconscious and consciousness. So that's kind of why we do what's important about it and why we do it. Of course, you could map, neural syntax map every bit. You could neural syntax map the current state. You could neural syntax map the outcome. You could neural syntax map the stucking. But the leverage point in all of this is really the stucking. You don't really need to know how they're doing themselves right now. You don't really need to know how they would be doing their outcome when they're doing it. you really need, from that, what I was just talking about with this, informing the system of process that they have not been conscious of, and informing the deep intuitions of both them and you, to look at how they are doing the not doing, how they are blocking, how they're stucking. So that's where it's powerful and useful. In my and Marvin's experience, that's what we found, that if we mapped that bit out of, given that you don't have half a day to do behavioural modelling with your client, you've usually got a 1 hour session, that if you, the leverage point for the change is if you map the stucking, the blocking, and then that gives you some deep generativity as you work through the rest of the process.
Nice. So I'll often say to a client when I'm working with them, and I make a bit of a joke of it, look, you're an intelligent, successful person, and I kind of remind them I only work with successful people. Why can't they just, do it? Why are they even talking to me? Why haven't they just sorted it out? What stops them? And it'll often be a surprise to them. So I totally get that. And they often don't know how to answer initially. They might go quiet and you'll pick up body information rather than verbal information in my experience. Yeah. What tips would you give people, maybe some of the newer coaches that are just coming through and still kind of working towards mastery in setting these processes up? What tips would you give them for what sort of things they're looking for in those first 10-20 seconds when you've asked the question, so what stops you?
Yeah, so what? It's a calibration question, right? He's saying, so what can you notice in how they use their mind-body system, their neurology? Because in order to answer the question, they will literally have to follow the pattern that is represented by what that question means, and that pattern is how they're stucking. So they literally will go through in micro muscle movements in their body the stucking, and if you are really good with your sensory acuity, if you really open up your filters so you're looking inside your own internal dialogue, etc. You ask the question and put all of your attention onto them and their patterns of movement, and you'll see by their gestures and swallowing and their eye movements and the shifts in their body and how they breathe, etc. You can literally see whether they're going sympathetic or parasympathetic dominant, whether they've got stuff going down at the gut level, the heart level. There'll be little micro muscle movements of their hands. They'll literally gesture towards head, heart, and gut in a pattern. It plays out very, very quickly. Of course, it might be so quickly with for some people, such small micro muscle movements that you won't see it. So that's when you give them that pause, you give them that time. They kind of digest the question. They kind of embody the processes, they pattern match to go, what is it? How do I do this? And then they'll start talking. Now, some of the things they'll say will be story. But in amongst it, the unconscious processes that are being used to generate the language that they're expressing are the unconscious processes that are doing the stucking. So those unconscious processes will choose words that match the pattern. So if you listen carefully, not necessarily to exactly what the person's saying, but to the choice of words and whether they're head, heart, gut, predicates, etc., and watch the gestures as they unpack what it is that they've been doing to be stucking, guided by yourself asking more judicious questions, you literally will see them give you the neural syntax. They'll start telling you about what's important to them and gesture to their heart as they talk about the values, etc. So you can, they'll go down to talking about how they get stuck in certain ways at a gut level from a motility perspective, and they'll put their hands at their gut. They'll point and gesture to their head if it's something where they're getting cognitive perspectives that are, so for example, if they're confusing themselves by using too many pictures and overlaying them and using some modalities that just cause head-based confusion, their hands will be up around their heads and pointing that, and they'll literally show you all of the submodality components of what they're doing at the head level. So you can easily, if you're watching and not inside yourself, but putting all your attention on your client, you can literally see this pattern unfold. And of course, what I like to do is draw a picture around them in my mind's eye, external to me, overlaid on them, of a series of arrows, pointing, going, it starts here, and then it goes down to here, and then it goes up to here. And they start at the heart level, and then they go up to the head, and they tell themselves this, and then it goes down from there down to the gut, and then from the gut it goes back to the heart. Oh, I can see that, yes. I can see if I did what that person is expressing, if I started at the heart level, focused on these things, went up to the head, said these things to myself at the head level, then that caused a gut reaction, that the gut responded that way, and then that fed back into my heart, which is now a complete loop. Yeah, I could get stuck in that loop. I could see how I could be stucking myself, and that's when, from a behavioural modelling perspective, as a coach, I go, if I get their model, if I get their recipe, right? If I literally go, oh, I get it, you made chocolate cake, and you did flour, then eggs, and etc. Oh, that's how you make chocolate cake. I could do that. So I go, if I have modelled and mapped this process out with this on a piece of paper in my mind's eye looking at them, and I go, I get it. I could do that stacking in my own life if I followed that model. Now I've got, I feel I've got a model that's veridical enough, truthful enough, useful enough for what they're doing, that we can now go, all right, this is informing. I feed it back to them, and if in feeding it back to them, their neurology lights up. And people really love to have this biofeedback of somebody feeding back their process. It makes them feel really validated. So when you feed that back, you can watch, they light up, they go, yes, it's like someone understands me. At times when I've done this, people have literally gone, oh, you're the first person who really understands. Okay, cool, that's excellent, fantastic. All right, now, that's how you do the stacking. Let's look at how that shifts when we start to communicate with the intelligences that are involved in that stacking. Because each of them is trying to do something that is very useful and powerful for you with what it knows currently. So within the context of how each brain is contextualizing this process, they're doing what they think is the most useful, and they're doing their prime functions. So let's find out what their needs and prime functions are that they want to have in play, that they're doing a very valid job for, and then let's find out what an emergent outcome is that will solve this situation, as in it would remove any conflict. There would be no conflicting if you're all working together. Let's bring the brains into high quality relating rather than conflicting.
Awesome. So is it usually a loop you're going to, or does sometimes it head down a dead end and get stuck in that way?
I wouldn't like to say always in anything, because humans are so amazingly flexible they can pretty much pull a rabbit out of any hat. But in my experience, the majority of the time that people are stuck is because they've got a loop going. If they didn't have a loop going, they'd probably find a way to get to the outcome. They just would have found a way through. But even when you say, like, do they go down, say, a hole, get stuck in the bottom of the hole, or get to a dead end, there is no dead ends. There'd be dead ending. So there has to be a loop back within itself, even if it's within they go into the gut, and then they stay in the gut, looping in the gut, looping through different prime functions of the gut, and that's it. And then the head and heart is completely, not having a real say in this particular situation. And for example, if it went to deep parasympathetic at the gut, it could go into a very deeply depressed place, very visceral depression, and then the head shuts down, and there are times in certain situations where the gut brain, for example, will produce an endogenous Valium, a form of something that will completely shut the head brain down. So the gut brain produces this, and it goes into the bloodstream, and it literally sedates the head brain down. So then the head brain stops thinking, and this is why we give people Valium when they're when they've had a terrible shock and they're incredibly upset, because we're mimicking the endogenous version of it. We use an exogenous drug to stimulate the receptors we have, and the only reason we have these receptors up in the head brains because we have a mind-body system that up and down regulates the multiple brains based on the environment and its ability, the whole system's ability to attempt to adapt within that environment. So you could get into a dead end in that way. One brain could just loop on itself, but there is always, in my experience, a looping, or it would just eventually get a trajectory that would go to end outcome. So, I am typically looking for a loop. But if I didn't find one, I wouldn't be too fast. As long as I could go, if I did that, if I take that process recipe, can I make that chocolate cake?
So that's your measure for you've done enough mapping the block, is that you can understand the processing that they're doing in order to be stuck.
Yeah, when I go, it makes sense to me. I get it. Right? Oh yeah, of course. Where if I'm still left with that feeling of going, I don't understand. If I had to do this behaviour, if I had to beat them, I just don't get it. I don't get how that neural syntax is stuck in them. Then it could be that I'm just being obtuse and don't understand it. But that's okay. Then let's get a bit more clarity so that I can stop stucking on understanding them, or I just haven't mapped it enough yet that we haven't got to that point. But generally, it comes out pretty quickly. You often see these loops very, very quickly. They're usually not that complex. I mean, I've come across a few where loops had to go through the multiple brains 2 or 3 times before they got into a full loop. But for most people, it's generally a simpler process. Most people stuck themselves pretty powerfully and pretty simply. It's just that they're stucking themselves outside of conscious awareness in very skillful unconscious patterns and loops that they've been doing most of their life. And those patterns and processes typically generalize across contexts. How they stuck in this is how they do stucking in other things in their lives. And that's why I want the generativity. That's why I want to bring this to conscious awareness and then help them to transcend in a way that takes them to wisdom of aligned head, heart, gut, which they've never had in that situation, and possibly not even in their many reference structure experiences in their life. They may be modelling from family situations, etc., where there's very little wisdom in the way the head, heart, gut, the bringing to awareness multiple distinctions. So it's really about informing their neurology into their existing patterns, giving them a reference structure example of doing it completely differently. It'll resolve this issue, get new emergence, and then it'll start to generate out into other contexts of their life and build new neural structures around this. So they start wisdoming themselves in new ways. And that's fantastic.
And who wouldn't want that?
That's my question.
And their stucking then could be very context specific, so that
as well can be.
If you were seeing a client on a recurring basis, every time they brought a new issue to you, you'd go back to that map in the block.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it really can be very context specific, but people are amazing in that they can contextualize stuff very, very specifically, and have a generalization operating in their patterning system to hold context constant. But as John Grinder points out, in the patterning system of the brain, of the mind-body system, patterns tend to generalize across contexts. So once you get a habit formed, a pattern formed in the neural structures, those patterns tend to generalize across contexts in your life. So if how someone walks is often how they drive, is often how they eat, it's how they dress. If you have a really snappy dresser, they don't usually have a really slobby car. If you have somebody who's a really slobby dresser, they don't really have a snappy car. There are exceptions to these patterns, and that's part of you can get people who can take a context and set generalizations around keeping that context constant, the walls of the context really firm. But for the most part, if you haven't installed that in yourself, then, or life hasn't, then you'll find the patterns generalize across contexts. So when you find one pattern of stucking with a client, you'll often find that they do that pattern of stucking across many contexts in their life. And what you want to do, of course, is not just give them the fish every time they come in hungry. You actually got to teach them way beyond that, so that they can generate new patternings that will go across all of the contexts of their life that are much wiser. So that is, teach them how to be able to calibrate and self-calm back to autonomic balance, because you make the wisest decisions from autonomic balance, and your multiple brains communicate in much more adaptive ways from autonomic balance. Teach them how to go to communicate between head, heart and gut in optimal ways, because a lot of people will do NIBs, neural integrated blocks, the ways of blocking the integration, the ways of blocking the communication for all their brains, and then they end up with patterns of not trusting parts of themselves, not trusting their heart in certain contexts, not trusting their gut, etc. Patterns of highest expressing, to start living from compassion, creativity, and courage in every moment of their lifing. And And from that will be the emergence of wisdom in their life. And that'll go across all contexts. And they'll start being wiser parents and wiser, colleagues and wiser workers and wiser voters and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Wiser in how they treat themselves. And that's got to be a good thing. And
fantastic.
Who wouldn't want that?
And who wouldn't want that? And that's why they're going to come and find an mBIT coach. So to all you mBIT coaches listening, thank you so much for joining in with our professional development series. Huge thank you, Grant, to you for sharing your deeper wisdom and knowledge about mapping the block. And I'm sure I'll think of a new topic for the next one very soon.
Okay, I'll look forward to it.